And there it goes.
And there it goes. Yeah, we still have only a few people on, so there's probably still some people joining. It looks like people are still jumping on, so we'll give ourselves another. So, all right.
Sorry, that was Ryan. He needed a password for some reason. Find that for him.
Okay, hopefully we won't have any too many technical issues. Let's go ahead and get started since it's 11 and the recording is rolling. So I'll go ahead and jump off. So halito everyone, welcome to the third session of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma Historic Preservation's Chat-Tata-Sholi virtual speaker series. My name is Jennifer Byram, and I serve as a research assistant in historic preservation. And I have the pleasure of introducing your panelists today, conducting our Q&A at the end. So be sure to send in your questions in the chat section as you have them during our session, and we'll get to those at the end. So as defined with the help of our elders at the School of Choctaw Language, a Chat-Tata-Sholi is a person who helps us to understand the history and knowledge of our Chata ancestors, which is why it is the title of our series. Through this series, we feature Choctaw community members, artists, culture bearers, scholars of Choctaw culture and history, and other experts. If you know someone who would be a great Chat-Tata-Sholi that you would like to hear from, please send us an email. Today, Dr. Joe Watkins, a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the forefather of the field of Indigenous Archaeology, will be in conversation with historic preservation tribal archaeologist Dr. Kristen Walczewski and Senior Director and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Dr. Ian Thompson. As archaeologists, they'll discuss the relationship between archaeology and Indigenous communities and the future of Indigenous archaeology as a field. Dr. Watkins' extensive and ongoing international archaeology work for Indigenous populations has helped communities exercise their sovereignty in the present day. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and pass it off to Kristen and Joe, as well as Ian, and I will make sure you guys are presenters. So.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And thanks again, Joe, for being here with us today. I can't tell you how excited I am to actually get to speak with you and ask you tons of questions. So let's go ahead and get started.
All right, great, thank you.
You're welcome. So for those of us for those in the audience with us today that might not be extremely familiar with Indigenous archaeology, can you briefly describe and define what Indigenous archaeology means for individuals that are joining us today?
Certainly. Well, first of all, archaeology itself is the study of humans in the past. We do some contemporary archaeology, which looks at various populations that exist today and their relationship with the past. So archaeology studies people. Many people get paleontology, dinosaurs, confused with what archaeologists do. We don't do dinosaurs, we do study past remnants of human cultures. So in that regard, archaeology informs us about history before we have written records. Indigenous archaeology itself is a branch of archaeology, but it deals primarily with doing the archaeology with people, by the people themselves, and generally has a benefit for the indigenous people that are doing the archaeology. So in that regard, rather than being a group of, say, objective scholars looking at material and then writing information, what indigenous archaeology does is try to get the community involved in determining what the issues that they would like to see researched, how that material should be presented, as well as a good basis on some of the interpretation. So that sort of in a nutshell is what Indigenous archaeology might be seen to be.
Excellent. So in a way, when you're doing archaeology that's for, by, and with the community, you're helping tribal communities maintain and exercise their sovereignty. So, in what ways does an indigenous archaeological approach help tribal communities maintain and exercise their sovereignty? And can you share any personal or anecdotal experiences that would highlight this?
I can try, sure. Indigenous archaeology has so many different forms. In the Northwest Coast, for example, there are tribal groups who do their own archaeology. They use an archaeological field school to help the high school students and college students understand their relationship with the people of the past. It helps them build connections with communities that have passed on maybe 100 years ago, but also communities that lived in the area, say 50 years ago, some of the ideas that they had and some of the things that they had to live through. So in that regard, giving them those connections beyond just what their grandparents told them, but to talk about the entire culture, helps them realize that their culture has existed since time immemorial, say, and has continued to exist. And it also gives them mechanisms whereby they can bring discussion of the past into contemporary situations and where they can better understand how they can contribute to their own culture today to make it exist and last for another 100 years, say. There are other people who have been working with boarding schools in Nevada. I'm sorry, I can't remember these names off the top of my head. My head has too many things bouncing around inside it these days. But their research looked at the boarding school and helped provide a student's face to the materials they found and what they encountered. That was much different than the stories that were presented in the official histories of the boarding schools. So just in those two situations, what we find is that Indigenous archaeology provides a background for people to understand the past, but also to see how it has contributed to the culture that is existing today. There's a jet flying in the background. I don't know how loud that is. I apologize that I haven't closed up all my windows and everything, but I think it's already 85 degrees here in Tucson at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning. So we try to keep the house cool as much as we can. I think some of the more interesting research we've done recently has been working with the Ainu in Hokkaido, Japan, Japan's northernmost island. Their indigenous archaeology is used to help the Ainu help develop a stronger, deeper history. They know their history from 15 and 1600s up until present, but what the indigenous archaeology has done is help them fill in the gaps between the archaeological cultures of 600 up to 1500 AD to their own culture. So we've been able to add further and further time depth to the histories that they already have. So we help them build on their own histories rather than trying to tell them what their histories really is. So in that regard, we work with people to help them find out how beneficial we can be, and actually, if we can be beneficial to them.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think that's one thing that always attracted me to an indigenous archaeological approach is that it has more of a human element to it. We have, of course, finding the artifacts is fun and, getting that tangible part of history is great, but it's really ultimately about connecting it to humans, what they did in the past and what their predecessors are doing now in the future and in the present.
Exactly.
So, hearing about some of the research that you've currently done, before you began your research and work regarding indigenous archaeology, what was the archaeological climate like in the United States? As a citizen of an indigenous community yourself, what flaws did you see in the way that archaeology was practiced in North America that ultimately catapulted you into defining and setting out methods and theories within this framework?
Well, I think that one of the important points of context is that I started doing archaeology formally, I guess, in 1968. And at that time, there was a great deal of civil unrest. The civil rights struggles were going in the South and Southeast. Red Power, the American Indian movement, was gaining a great deal of traction, beginning primarily in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in that region, but spreading around the United States. There was a lot of protest about indigenous rights, Indian rights, and so on. So at that time, archaeology was basically seen as an objective science that was meant to tell the story of past cultures. Many archaeologists seem to believe that all the real Indians had gone, that there weren't any Indians anymore, and so that archaeology felt it was up to them to give the Indians their history. At that time, I was one of a handful of American Indians who were doing archaeology. And many times the idea was that doing archaeology was somehow bad, and that many American Indians equated archaeologists with grave robbers, that people who went out and dug up graves, stole the bones, stole all the pots, and threw away everything else. So I kind of had a difficult time really walking the middle road at that time. In 1969, when I started my fall semester at the University of Oklahoma, there was this little book that was published. It was called Custer Died for Your Sins, written by Vine Deloria Jr. And in that, it talked about the very definite controversies and conflicts between anthropologists, archaeologists, and American Indians. And so, on the one hand, as an American Indian doing archaeology, the archaeologists didn't feel they could trust me because I couldn't be really an objective archaeologist if I was an American Indian. The American Indians, on the other side, decided that, well, I couldn't really be trusted either if I was doing archaeology, because I was just going to go out and dig up everybody's ancestors and put them in museums. So it was very difficult. It took a lot of time to come to an understanding of what I felt I wanted to do and actually how I thought I might be able to do it. I originally wanted to go to work in Europe, and I always made a joke that I was going to go to Europe and dig up their ancestors rather than dig up my own. Some people laughed at it. Other people thought I was extremely serious. So I don't know. Occasionally, trying to speak with your tongue in your cheek doesn't really work that well. But I did actually get to go to France in 1972. Worked with Francois Bourd. He was one of the major archaeologists at that time, one of the grandfathers of archaeology and the father of typology, looking at describing stone tools, not based on actually how we interpreted they may have been used, but based on morphological techniques. So it was a great deal of learning. Francois Bourd used to joke with me that his ancestors ate buffalo before mine did. So we had a lot of running jokes at that time, and it was quite an experience, and it made me realize that one could do archaeology and do good archaeology regardless of where you lived, what your background was, provided that you do have an understanding that it was people who created the artifacts and not just artifacts existing without people. That's sort of a brief history of how I viewed archaeology at that time in the late 60s, early 70s.
Wow, that's just extremely insightful. It's one thing to, read your research and follow what you do, and then just to hear kind of the background of it. It's really, I mean, I can see where your theories and your methods came from. That's really cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, kind of in a similar vein, you've seen laws and acts such as NAGPRA and ARPA and the National Historic Preservation Act. You've seen these laws enacted and their movement or push from infancy to actual legislation. What was that journey like for you personally to see such dramatic changes in Indigenous rights occur?
It was a real shift in perspective. In 1979, I started working. I worked for a year with Heritage Conservation and Recreational Services, a part of the Department of the Interior, stationed in Atlanta. And at that time was just when the Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979 was in discussion and then was passed. So it was an immediate reaction at that time. ARPA actually defines archaeological resources as human skeletal remains, or I should say human skeletal remains are considered to be archaeological resources. So that, in conversations with many American Indian tribes at that time, there was a great deal of concern at the fact that non-Indian human remains were considered sacred in a way, and they were returned to cemeteries, whereas human remains were sent to museums. The University of Iowa passed one of the first state reburial laws based on a situation where a highway crew had discovered 129 sets of human remains, 127. These were all in a single cemetery, all in the same plots, as it were. The 127 remains were boxed up and sent to a mortician for reburial. One set of human remains, well, two sets of human remains, a woman and a child, were actually, because of the materials that were found with them, beaded objects, buckskin and such, they were actually boxed up and sent to museums. So tribes were drawing attention to the inconsistency of state laws and ultimately federal laws. The shift from this concept that's embodied by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 grew out of this Iowa reburial law, and it grew out of a rarely discussed law called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. That law was passed in 1978. And in 1979, there were a series of discussions and consultations held across the United States. There were 8 in the United States, 1 in Alaska, and 1 in Hawaii. So those laws really called attention to the inconsistent treatment of American Indian human remains versus that of European or non-Indian human remains. So the Repatriation Acts of 1989 and 1990 have really been attempts to try to equalize the treatment, both archaeologically as well as in museums. So it's been an interesting perspective watching how things have changed, and especially as more and more American Indian get training in archaeology, as American Indians become archaeologists themselves, they offer a much broader perspective and a much more informed voice that can really help guide this legislation and future regulations and legislation.
Oh, exactly. That kind of goes into my next question. Based on all of these experiences that you've had and the research that you've done, have you noticed a general trend of improvement between archaeologists and Indigenous communities? And if not, is there any hypotheses or reasonings as to how archaeologists can begin to fix these issues?
I have noticed a very definite change. I believe that here in the Western United States, relationships are generally much better. The tribes and archaeologists work together. Many archaeologists are actually employed by tribes in the tribal historic preservation offices. And so they can actually bring the tribal perspective to the practice of archaeology and to any archaeological projects that happen to occur on tribal land. The relationships are much more strained, I believe, as we move back toward the east. Much of that relates to the fact that in the West, there are much larger tribal expanses of land. There's much more reservation. There's much more of an in situ and in place ownership and relationship in the land. And with the East, the fact that there was so many removals and many tribes were pushed further and further west, the tribal relationship, the immediate relationship with land is a little more removed. The tribes, like for example, the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, is involved in trying to protect the materials in the homelands in the southeastern United States. But the tribe and the nation is hampered by the fact that we don't own the land is in private ownership, and the states have less of a relationship to the tribe as many other states do in the West. So I do see that as the younger generations of archaeologists, I guess people who have obtained their training and received their degree since the passage of the Repatriation Acts of '89 and 1990, those people are much more aware of their responsibilities to work with tribal people. They're much more aware of the ideas that these materials have importance to contemporary tribes, and they're not just museum pieces. So I've noticed that as the older generation of archaeological practitioners move away from being at the forefront of the practice of archaeology, the relationship between tribal members, tribes, and archaeologists is improving a great deal.
It's good to hear. And one thing that I noticed throughout all of my educational experiences is that while I've learned a lot from my mentors, I really had to seek out, this indigenous archaeological approach. Do you think this experience and knowledge is something that is readily passed on to the next generation of archaeologists, or like me, are they having to start from scratch and seek out these mentors? So before this interview started, I kind of did a brief Google search of undergraduate programs that offer an indigenous archaeological, if it's a degree or just focus. And it doesn't seem like there's too many in the United States. So what are your opinions on that?
There are not very many actual programs that teach the indigenous archaeological approach. Mostly it's individual archaeologists who are involved and recognize the utility of it and teach it, much the same way that there are individual archaeologists across the United States who might do paleoecological research or who may do zooarchaeology. It's very much a specialty, and part of the issue would be that even if you really want to do indigenous archaeology, you have that burning within you to make you want to go out and help tribal groups in that regard. It's up to the tribes themselves to be able to say, yes, we want you to do this. Yes, we welcome you in. There's still a great deal of suspicion about archaeologists among the tribes. I believe that as individuals, archaeologists work to develop relationships, first with individual tribal members, then with people within the tribes who have utility to utilize archaeology, then things will become much more easier. One of my best friends, George Nicholas, at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia is just now hiring a community archaeologist. It's going to be an academic position, an individual whose responsibility will be to work with communities, both tribal communities and non-tribal communities, to develop a community-based approach to doing archaeology. So it's becoming much more mainstream. There are Indigenous archaeologists who are doing instruction in mainstream universities. Sarah Gonzalez at the University of Washington is one, or Merrick Martinez at Northern Arizona University. Davina Tubears just completed her degree at Indiana and is trying to get herself situated in an academic position where she can actively mentor students. We have found that when I was at the University of New Mexico, I had a couple of students who came to University of New Mexico to work with me, one of which I am extremely proud of, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer there at the Choctaw Nation, Dr. Ian Thompson. So we have found that individuals generally attract other individuals. And it is almost like it has to be a one-on-one mentorship. We can teach archaeology and archaeological techniques to anyone and everyone. We can teach people how to interpret particular objects and ideas and thoughts, but we cannot give the drive to individuals to work with community unless it's already there. We can't teach them the utility of it unless they already recognize it.
Oh, I definitely agree. We talk about that in the department all the time. We can train anyone to do anything, but you can't train someone to have heart. So that's
Exactly.
true. Yeah. So kind of going off of that, if you're having so few institutions in the United States offering an Indigenous archaeological approach to their programs, what are some other avenues of training archaeologists in this method and this framework, such as webinars or training sessions? I've talked with a few colleagues myself, and we're trying to figure out some ideas to get this kind of training and perspective to CRM companies, people who call themselves shovel bombs, just out there digging holes and maybe not really having much of a connection to the landscape that they're on.
Right. I do believe that webinars and those sorts of directed trainings can be very helpful. There are people who have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about Indigenous archaeology. Many of those people would gladly participate in Indigenous-led programs that are based on community ideas if they knew how to get involved. There are also, the part of the issue becomes trying to create programs. The unfortunate thing, of course, is formalized programs cost money. I hate to bring that up, but it takes funding in order to pay individuals to do the background research, to pay for the gasoline, to get out and to actually do the archaeology. What I believe we can do is that through particular and focused training, which gives a better understanding of the different utilities of archaeology and even a better understanding of the different ways that cultures communicate with each other. I think once we can get people to understand that if I say yes, it doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with what you said. It may just mean that, yes, I hear that you said something and I will need a little bit of time to make a decision. So we have different communication styles. Tribal groups generally have a different communication style than European Western groups do. So with an awareness of that different communication, it helps gain a better understanding of the different needs for archaeology. So I think that tribally run training programs can provide that perspective that non-Indigenous people can use to help them understand the differences between doing archaeology as just earning a living and doing archaeology as providing a meaning.
Definitely, definitely. So this is one topic that for my own dissertation I was really interested in. So regarding things like oral histories and TCPs, and my favorite, the idea in many tribes that natural resources are considered cultural resources. What have you observed archaeologists' perspective of these as legitimate forms of history record keeping? And has this changed over time?
It has changed a bit over time. There's still there's still a large number of mainstream archaeologists who believe that tribal histories, oral histories, since they are not written down, then they are subject to change. And they also believe that they are subject to interpretation. There are some people who consider oral histories myths and therefore don't recognize that there probably are kernels of truth that led to the development of the original stories. I think the difficult situation for archaeologists is that we try to tell our stories based on probably 3 to 5% of the materials that the cultures who existed actually left for us to find. If we look at what we wear on a daily basis, very little of it would continue to exist over the course of, say, 1,000 years. The plastic and glasses would, probably the wires, maybe the beads would. Clothing would not, except for maybe buttons or a couple of the hasps. So really, we archaeologists are hampered by really just the 3% of what they have and what they can interpret. They construct their stories based on their own backgrounds. They know what a button looks like, but they wouldn't know what a wire hasp would look like if they didn't have wire, for example. So tribes construct their stories based on histories that have been passed along, and they very definitely have a place. My wife, Carol Ellick, created a program called Parallel Perspectives. And in that regard, what she does is she presents the archaeological story, and then side by side, she presents the tribal story. So it was primarily for grades K through 12, or actually high school students. So in that regard, the students get to weigh both stories. They get to realize that both of them are valid, that they both have meaning, and that they both tell different aspects of what those stories mean. And so in that regard, I do see the utility of it. Part of the issue with archaeologists, again, many are constrained by what they see, or maybe what they don't see, to be the limitations of the archaeological record. Walter W. Taylor in the 1960s wrote a book lambasting archaeologists who failed to provide conjecture based on what they found. He said that all that they were hampered by the materiality of the archaeological record, and for them not to guess about what these things might mean was problematic. So in that regard, I still continue to see the validity in that there are many archaeologists who feel like they can't say anything about anything that's not immediately present in the archaeological record. I do think in terms of traditional cultural properties, the National Park Service has determined that traditional stories and utility, traditional stories do have a utility to help explain the importance of areas to tribes and to tribal communities. Also, if we look at the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, tribal stories and tribal history is considered to be one of the 10 lines of evidence that can be used in repatriation claims. So since the 1990s, science, I don't want to say science, the federal government has at least determined that there is a place within science for these classes of information to be used. That was kind of a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's perfect. It's great to hear, as an archaeologist, we have so many tools that we can add to our toolbox. And I've always found it interesting when archaeologists, when some claim that, oral histories have no validity. I'm like, it's just another form of evidence. It may not be what you're accustomed to looking at, but it's still a line of evidence to consider. So that's great, and it's good to hear that at least the federal government does have stipulations listed within the acts.
Right.
So you've kind of touched on this already a little bit, but I don't know if you wanted to expound upon it. In what ways have you seen the field of Indigenous archaeology grow and change since its first conception? And what do you expect for the future of this field and relationships between archaeologists and Indigenous communities, both in North America and around the world? Improvements and changes?
Well, yeah, I've seen it really grow. In 1979, when I was in Atlanta, there were 3 American Indians with MAs. There was Smokey Moore, Ed Ladd, and me. Those were all the American Indians that I knew or could ever find that had MAs in archaeology. Now, I have no idea how many there are with PhDs in archaeology. I used to know every single one of them. I actually knew the first 20, but I've lost track of the numbers. I lost track of the count. And I think I like that. I think that's very important. The fact that I can no longer count Indigenous archaeologists on my fingers and toes. That now it will require another couple of people's hands and feet in order to get that list. I think with the idea that American Indians can get a degree in archaeology, I think that has been a major sea change. In the past, American Indians wouldn't touch archaeology. They might do, well, Vine Deloria at one point said it best. He said, we have enough American Indian engineers, American Indian attorneys, and American Indian doctors. What we need now are American Indian academicians, American Indians with degrees in all fields in order to continue to teach our children and everybody else's children about what it means to be Indian. So in that regard, I think the fact that we are getting more and more American Indian archaeologists says something good about the growth of the field of Indigenous archaeology. A colleague of mine, Japanese man named Hirofumi Kato, teaches Indigenous archaeology at the University of Hokkaido in Japan. My wife Carol and I were invited to Hokkaido in 2007 to give a lecture to talk about the development of Indigenous archaeology and what it meant and what it means. So Dr. Kato has had a program working with the Ainu, Japan's indigenous population, on doing Indigenous archaeology on Hokkaido Island. He has received some pushback, if you will, from professional archaeologists in Hokkaido and in Japan for his approach to doing Indigenous archaeology, because those archaeologists are still very much the idea that you do archaeology for the science to tell the story of the past. And therefore, you don't need to be working with community because the government of Tokyo, of Japan, owns these resources. And so therefore, it doesn't belong to any one community. But Dr. Kato Hirofumi continues to be active. He continues to train his certain Japanese students in the approach to doing Indigenous archaeology. Each year they have a field school where they split into 2, and one group will be excavating, while the other group is going out, talking with community, hearing from Ainu individuals, participating in community-based activities in order to gain a better understanding of what their work, how their work impacts community. In Australia, Claire Smith has been doing Indigenous archaeology for 20 years, working with the communities of Virunga in Northern Australia and the Northern Territory. She tells stories of having found some material in an anthropological report. And so she was giving this talk to a council in Virunga, and she read this passage, and the council immediately stopped and talked among themselves. And then Claire said, "Is there something wrong?" The council leader said, "Well, we're trying to decide whether we need to kill you or not, because that material is all men's knowledge and you're not supposed to know it. We're going to induct you into our council right now so that we don't have to kill you because we like you."
Wow.
And so it's stories like that that recognize, or that make me realize the impact that archaeologists can have on communities, and how a nuanced approach to helping communities rewrite their histories can be important to them. My grandmother always talked about helping write unwritten histories, because a story that I've written about and talked about a lot. I found an arrowhead on my family homestead when I was 10 years old. I didn't speak enough Choctaw except to get my face slapped on occasion. And my grandmother didn't really speak a lot of English, but my cousin Shirley, Erlene Farley's mother, hi Erlene if you're there, translated basically and let me know that my grandmother felt that that history didn't belong to the Choctaw, but it belonged to the people who had been there before we came, and that she felt it was important that our unwritten history and their unwritten history not get lost. So that's why I really got into archaeology.
Wow, that is amazing. It really it's good to hear that there's archaeologists around the world that are doing this, and fighting the good fight. We need people in every corner of the world that are going to advocate and work with tribal communities and indigenous communities. And, I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy to hear these stories. So, you're currently serving as the president of the Society for American Archaeology. In this position, have you noticed an increase in sessions that focus on work guided by an indigenous archaeological framework? And in your opinion, what ways are organizations such as SAA and Society for Historical Archaeology working towards fostering better collaborative relationships between archaeologists and indigenous communities? Ultimately, what momentum do you see?
Thank you. As president of the Society for American Archaeology, it's been an interesting ride. The first president of the SAA, Arthur C. Parker, was of Seneca heritage. He was president in 1934, 1935. And so really to think that it's taken 85 years for the next American Indian person to be president, it kind of gives you a perspective on both the field of archaeology and the amount of voice that American Indians may have in the practice of archaeology. I do see that there are more and more sessions on indigenous archaeology or indigenous aspects of archaeology. But I think it as well, a couple of things. One, it's the idea that indigenous archaeology is growing, that there are more people that are doing it, that there are more younger students who want to see it being presented in a more formal situation. I think it's also a testament to the fact that the Society of Historical Archaeology and the Society for American Archaeology are deeply involved in community based outreach in all regards. There have been a great deal of push, both the SHA and the SAA, in terms of diversity initiatives. The Society for American Archaeology offers 3, 4 or 5 scholarships to American Indians to get training in archaeology. There's the Arthur C. Parker Scholarship, which provides a fairly large stipend for American Indians, either American Indian students, but also employees in American Indian programs to attend training events to get training in archaeology. The Society also has received an NSF grant, which pays for, I think, 3 scholarships, one in to do graduate level archaeology, one for undergraduate students, and I believe that there are a couple of others for different prospects. Again, you can see that information on the SAA webpage. So that's one way that the society itself is reaching out, not trying to create American Indian archaeologists, but trying to give American Indians a better understanding of what archaeology is and what archaeology can do. And that's a big shift. Back in the 70s, the archaeologists used to say, well, if they only knew what we did, they would welcome us, and they would want us to be involved. There's still a few archaeologists who feel that way, but I'm not going to name any names, although I could. But now I do see a change in that there's much of a broader interest in recognizing that all communities should be involved in how archaeology is practiced and the stories that archaeologists tell. Not just American Indians, African American, Hispanic, Russians, all the different ethnic groups across the United States have their own stories and their own histories. And those are reflected in many of the archaeological resources across the United States.
Yeah, they're definitely excellent resources too, which kind of goes into my next question. What advice would you give to budding non-tribal archaeologists that have a desire to work with Indigenous communities?
My advice to the non-tribal archaeologists who do want to work with Indigenous communities is to make yourself known, get out, interact with tribal people. The important thing is not to expect to be able to show up with a degree on a tribal doorstep and say, I want to do Indigenous archaeology. You should hire me right now. I think it's important, and I tell professional archaeologists all the time, is to develop a relationship before you ever try to utilize it. Don't develop a relationship because you need to have it. Develop a relationship, help the tribe however they would like for you to help, and then eventually offer your more professional services if they still see a need for it. Too many archaeologists say, well, you know, I went to the tribe and I really wanted to help them and they didn't want me. Don't they know what they're missing? And, you know, it's still that idea that many tribes really don't trust people who come in off the doorstep and say, I want to help you. There have been too many programs that have been aimed at helping tribes in the past that have led to scary results. In the 1870s and 1880s, with the push towards civilizing the American Indian, it led to boarding schools, it led to reservations, it led to allotments. And so tribes have a long history. I also try to recommend to young students to find out the history of the tribal groups in the areas where they might want to work. Recognize that there is some complicity in the way that history is played out, and that will give them a better understanding as to why the tribes themselves might not welcome them. And then I tell students to talk to everybody they can who is working with tribes and find out if there's anything that they can do to volunteer to tribes, volunteer to work with tribes. And sometimes volunteering is nothing more than cleaning up after a powwow or 49 or something like that. But it does gain you relationships that will help inform your professional life for the rest of your life.
I definitely agree, and that's excellent advice. A lot of it I wish I would have received when I was starting off as an archaeologist. But thankfully, I've been embraced and as my time as a tribal archaeologist with Choctaw Nation, and I feel like I'm learning something new every day. Every time I meet with a tribal member, every time I'm out with the community, it's just constantly learning about something new. So it leads me to my final question. As my time as the tribal archaeologist, I've met with some youth and even adults who have expressed interest in learning more about archaeology. So what advice would you give to Indigenous youth who might be interested in pursuing archaeology or even another closely related field?
I would suggest reading. There are quite a few books. I could probably pull together a list of books eventually that would help. There's a book by George Nicholas called Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeologists. It's a nice book. It's an easy read, and much of it has stories of people, Indigenous archaeologists, both here in the United States as well as in Australia and New Zealand. Some of their backgrounds. It helps provide an understanding of what they went through and why they decided they want to do it. There are some little golden books, easy reads that talk about archaeology, that talks about the basics of archaeology, gives some of the histories of archaeology. I would recommend that interested people go to their online virtual library or wherever and then just do an archaeological search of basics of a Google search of basics of archaeology. There are all across the United States, there are very large numbers of local anthropological societies that have either spring or fall digs. It gives people the opportunity to go out, interact with other people, have a better understanding of what archaeology is, that it can be very exciting, but it can be hot, humid, muggy, sweaty, ticky, chiggery, and all those other things that we don't really think about when we're in the comfort of our living rooms. But it's great fun. You meet some great people. So the Oklahoma Anthropological Society, I don't know how their field schools are acting now in this time of COVID-19, but there are opportunities for students and interested people to volunteer to work on archaeological excavation surveys and such. Basically, I would suggest that they really just reach out to people that they want to talk with for an hour or two, or maybe just to get input from about what the possibilities really are.
That's excellent advice. Excellent. Joe, I just want to extend a heartfelt yakoki for being here with us today and for answering all of my questions. I'm pretty sure I can't see if there's any questions from participants. Jennifer might be able to see that, but we can take some of those questions now.
Yeah, and also I know Ian Thompson, he has limited connection at different points, but I know maybe you might have wanted to jump in at different times. So Ian, if you wanted to respond or if you had anything as well, feel free to jump in now or anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Joe, for sharing your knowledge with us. I mean, you've been in every walk of archaeology. You've been involved in it for 50 years. You've done work with Francois Board. You've done experimental archaeology. You've done contract archaeology. You've done federal archaeology, tribal archaeology. You've been an archaeology professor, Native American Studies director. You've been in charge of some federal programs. With all of that vast experience, what insight do you have for us less experienced archaeologists that could help us to take it to a better place? I mean, you've seen so much. What do you think would be the most root thing that we could do to improve the discipline?
I think the most basic thing you can do to improve the discipline is to talk, to interact with people, to let your voices be heard. I know that quite often students are afraid to ask questions. They're afraid to communicate with other people about their concerns because that's the way many tribal people are taught. They're taught not to speak out. They're taught that their elders know everything, and so they're not supposed to ask any questions. And so in that regard, in many ways, that's a problem that we have to move beyond. We have to recognize that in the dominant culture, asking questions is how we can get better answers and how we can better craft Indigenous archaeology. We do have many Indigenous people involved in federal service, both in terms of, like, say, the National Park Service, as archaeologists, but also as administrators and managers. So we were able to get those perspectives out there like that. I think that the more archaeologists that we can produce that have at least an understanding of Indigenous perspectives will help move the field that much further, that much more quickly. I don't feel like it's interesting. I probably enjoyed teaching more than I've done any of those other things. Teaching is a way to actually get a great deal of one-on-one time with students. My perspectives and my range of thoughts expanded so much, listening to students, listening to their concerns. And quite often it was something that I hadn't really thought of because I didn't have the vast experience to ask those questions. And so I learned as much, if not more, from my students. So in that regard, I think that instructors, either formal or informal instructors, can reach people exponentially. I can tell 10 people who can each tell 10, and so on and so on. So in a short period of time, we could circle the world with the good thoughts and the good points of Indigenous archaeology. It's kind of scary at times to think about all the different aspects of doing archaeology that I've been around and how CRM has changed, and the fact that now probably 75% of the archaeologists in the United States are involved in CRM in one form or another. And now that the academy is a minority of positions, and yet we put so much weight on the academicians to actually teach archaeologists what we feel they need to know. I think that it's up to each one of us to actually teach people about the utility of Indigenous archaeology as it grows out of the basics of just academic archaeology. Don't know if I answered your question, if I just got off on a tangent, but
I think you absolutely did. It's an answer that empowers everybody.
thank you, Ian. I appreciate it.
All right, so if I can jump in, and Ryan Spring has been waiting for a half hour to ask his question, so he sent it twice to make sure it got in there. So how can the community be empowered to use Indigenous archaeology at a grassroots level? And how can the community utilize Indigenous archaeology to protect and pass on their cultural resources?
I think it's very important for the community to recognize well, first and foremost, what archaeological materials look like. We lose a great deal of archaeological material to farming, to erosion, actually to pot hunting and looting. I think it's important that the community, by being given an understanding of what archaeological materials look like, what archaeology can do, and what it means to the community, I think that the community can be the forefront of recognizing the threats to the materials, the cultural heritage of the people who lived in southeastern Oklahoma prior to the Choctaw getting there, but also the materials that are important to the Choctaw. There are a large number of homesteads from the allotment period and really from the 1840s that we don't know anymore. Many of those homesteads have family cemeteries or graves associated with them. My family cemetery, northwest of Wright City, Oklahoma, has the family graves, my great grandfather all the way to my father, as well as some other relatives. And so if those get lost, or if that allotment were to leave our family hands, it would be difficult for us to be able to protect them. So I think that the community can be our first eyes to recognize when archaeological materials are being looted, dug up, or destroyed. So in that regard, I think it's important. I know that the tribal archaeology program doesn't have nearly enough archaeologists to cover the entire Choctaw Nation. And so I think that the Forest Service used to have a training program, I'm not sure whether they still do or not, for archaeological technicians, that they provided training in recognizing archaeological materials. They provided training in archaeological laws. They provided some training in doing archaeological survey. And so that sort of training would be beneficial in order for people who are interested, in order to provide enough so that those communities could be on the lookout for impacts to the archaeological heritage. And so I think that is probably the best way to get started in creating such a program. I think the community can use Indigenous archaeology as a means of knowing that if there is an area that the community wants more information about, that Indigenous archaeology can provide a deeper history beyond just archives or beyond just the written history. And so in that regard, I think that the community can communicate their desires to whomever, whether or not that's a Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, the Oklahoma Historical Society, the Oklahoma Anthropological Society. Once the community can get started in conversation, then the conversation can develop hopefully into something that would be beneficial to the community. Ryan, I hope that answered your question to an extent. Right now, so much of it is communities. It's difficult to talk about a community because each one is so different. Batiste is so different than Bochito. And so each community will have their own need and their own idea about how they could utilize Indigenous archaeology. And then I would ask also that the communities, if they are interested, contact Ian and Kristen and ask for someone to come talk to the community about what it is, what they can do, and what it can mean for local people.
That was a great answer. Thank you. So I have a few. The questions keep piling up, so buckle up.
Okay.
Lexi Rue Harris put in a note that the U.S. Forest Service still has that training available that you mentioned, available to tribes who may be interested. So just follow up with that. Then Pierce Wright says, "Hi, Dr. Watkins. I'm a student at OU and thankful for your leadership in the archaeological community. Do you have any tips for students or researchers who wish to engage and collaborate without putting the burden of engagement on Indigenous communities?"
It is difficult. Trying to find ways to collaborate with Indigenous communities is difficult in that it does not, you can't force a community to collaborate. More often collaboration stems from the perspective of both the community and the Indigenous group. The community and the archaeologist, that a need is recognized, the community recognizes that what can happen and how each one can contribute. They're at the University of Oklahoma. I can't remember Paul Spicer and maybe Paul and Lori Spicer. There is an institute on South Campus there at the university who works with tribal communities on many times on health issues. But he and Lori both are at the Department of Anthropology. And I would suggest, Mr. Wright, that you reach out to them and ask them, see if you can get a time with them that you can sit down and talk about how they have found ways of interacting and collaborating with community at the University of Oklahoma. They have been, as I say, they've been involved primarily with health issues and community-based participatory research derives initially from many of the health sciences fields. And so archaeology is trying to bring that in as well. But Paul and Lori are good people, they're good resources, and they can probably help you understand how they have gone about collaborating with communities.
All right, and I should mention that Pierce Wright will be sharing his master's research in August in this same speaker series. So he's definitely been in touch and kind of making himself available to our department in any way he can help. So yeah.
Well, Jennifer and Kristen, can you be certain to send me the link in the notice just so that I know exactly? I mean, I hate to say I get more than 100 emails a day, but on occasion it seems like thousands. But I would appreciate the reminder, a pointed reminder.
Yes, and I will say Joe has been extremely kind and responsive all along the way. As I actually just got through the process of applying for PhD, so I'm very impressed by how on top of it you are with everything. But we'll keep charging through the Q&A because there's a lot of people who have questions. So Maddie Curry, who's also in our department and works with Section 106, asked Dr. Watkins, what are your feelings about the current accessibility of archaeological research? Are there ways that we can make research more accessible, not just to Indigenous communities, but to the public as a whole? Yakoki.
Well, I do believe the accessibility of archaeological research. Part of the issue is that most of the materials that the research is published is based on federal projects and federal programs. And many of that research has, is published in what's called gray literature. It's materials that is being sent out by cultural resource management firms and primarily for compliance with federal laws. Those reports quite often carry with them site locations, site descriptions that would allow unscrupulous people from going out and finding the archaeological sites and perhaps looting them or destroying them. I think that in the past, there used to be a requirement for these sorts of reports, for public reports to be produced along with the technical reports. Many of those public reports were retained on file by the cultural resource management firm. And there really isn't a good way of getting it out there to the general public. There are a few great synthesizers, if you will. Brian Fagan is probably the more famous of the academic synthesizers. He writes stories that talks about archaeology of the world, of local regions, of particular states and such. But there are very few people who know how to write for the general public, write stories that are interesting to the general public and that aren't aimed primarily at one particular compliance or another. I think that, Maddie, I would love to find an individual who could take this information, especially all the public reports, and create a place on, say, the Choctaw Tribal Historic Web that interested individuals could access reports that are available for them to read. I don't know how available the servers are, or if there's an individual who could be tasked with uploading and maintaining it. I know that getting it online is the easy thing, but maintaining it, being certain that the links continue to work, that if anyone has any questions that they get answers, that's the difficult thing. So it would be nice if one of these days that it would be possible for the tribe to be able to gather information about the Choctaws themselves that could be available into publicly available reports written for the general public.
And I will say, and thank you for that answer. That's a great call to kind of action as far as what projects we can be working on. And we are working on a website continually, the Hinahanta website, which is initially really a collections database website for the Choctaw Nation museums. So not archaeology focused at the moment, but certainly there is some content on there, and hopefully we can expand it over time to be more informative and educational, and to represent what's beyond, just our resources, but what's out there that we could provide access for people.
Good.
So Pierce Wright did say, Yakoki said he just wanted to pass that along. Then Adam Sebastian had a question. Any encouragement for a tribal member working at Choctaw Nation surrounded by more of a business culture, supporting financial growth, but maybe not prioritizing Choctaw values and culture as much? So do tribal members only belong in tribal services? Asking for a friend.
Well, there are two questions, or two interpretations. Do tribal members only belong in tribal services? Or the other question is, do only tribal members belong in tribal services? And either one of those questions is a great question. Thank you, Adam, for bringing it up. Right now in this contemporary society, we do have, tribal groups and Indian nations have always had two separate but necessary bodies. We have the governing body that deals with Western concepts of what we need in order for the nation as a whole to continue to exist. And then we have the traditional body that embodies stories, religions, ideas, and concepts, which requires that in order for the Choctaw Nation to continue to exist, it needs to have that heart, that understanding of what it means to be Choctaw. So I do recognize that the necessity and the utility of working within a business model But I also recognize that we can work within a business model that empowers tribal members in many different ways. We can have people who have training in finance and all they do all day long is post accounts receivable or accounts payable, but we can also provide them training that would give them a better understanding not only of what accounts payable means, but what the culture that these accounts payable is adding to. For example, for people who just see bills coming in about concrete work, about construction, they gain an understanding of what that concrete work and that construction is building in terms of the Choctaw Culture Center. That gives a different tribal meaning to what that individual is doing in their day-to-day job. So gaining a tribal perspective on the entire interactions of the Choctaw Nation is difficult, but if we can provide some background, I think it will help individuals recognize that what they are doing is more than just providing income for the Choctaw Nation. It's providing actual things of benefit to individuals that give them individual tribal meaning beyond just the building that is a hull there. So Adam, I hope that answers your question one way or another.
Yeah, that was a great question and a great answer to that. I mean, it is a big thing of, many different people came together for the cultural center, and so the projects take a lot of support. So we do have another question from Sue Folsom, who is the director of, or executive director of our Cultural Services Department, and the question got a little bit cut off, but I will just kind of throw it out there. Maybe she can finish it. But in collaborations with the Choctaw community, do you agree that trust building is at the top of, and I'm assuming the list, or top of, is the highest priority?
Hi, Sue. Good to see you. Good to hear from you. Yes, I believe trust building is important in everything we do. If there used to be an old joke about, trust me, I work for the government. So we have currently, there are particular aspects of the federal government that is mistrusted by a large number of people. In the past, relationships between archaeologists and tribal people has resulted in distrust. We've had archaeologists who have worked on tribal lands and have taken tribal materials away, written things that were unflattering to the tribes. And so the tribes have immediately distrusted everyone. And so each time that I meet someone, I have to overcome whatever distrust they may have in their culture, history, and their backgrounds. So I do believe it's important that we as archaeologists, that the cultural program continue to do things that demonstrate our trustability to interact with tribal members, tribal groups, and communities so that they can really come to understand that they can trust us. They can trust us to protect their heritage. They can trust us with their cultural histories and their stories. And they can trust us to do what we can to help them meet their needs. And so in that regard, we cannot continue to rely on what we did last week. We have to continue each day to demonstrate that we are trustworthy and that we will help the communities to the best of our abilities. So Sue, I hope that answers your question, but yes, I am a firm believer that we have to continue to reaffirm the trust the community has in us.
Yes, and Sue actually put she added that and which was at the top of the list of learning. So the trust building is at the top of the list of learning. But I think, still your answer stands that that's of the utmost importance to continue this work.
Thank you. Okay, good.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Joe's been doing an amazing job just kind of going back and forth with all of these tough questions. And we really appreciate your time and sitting with us and having these conversations. I'm really just so impressed, like I said earlier, with how much you all accomplish, Ian and Kristen as well. There's so much work to be done, and just looking to the future, starting out, I'm really very impressed. So my question would be more, how do you do it all? But I think it does seem like it's a lot of a partnership and many people involved to get that work done.
Certainly. We all build on the shoulders of giants. Our ancestors who have gone before us, our colleagues who work with us, the people who have done archaeology, the tribal members. All I can ever hope to do is to continue to contribute, that eventually down the line, whenever I am no longer a part of this world, that at least one individual sometime in the future will be able to say that, yeah, this individual made a difference, either for me as an individual or for a community. And that's all I keep hoping to do, is to try to make a difference. Again, I think that the person I am now is so different than the person I was 50 years ago. I'm surprised that I've survived this long and continue to do archaeology and have done archaeology. I'm very honored to have been invited to be here today. I'm always surprised when people want to know my opinion, because it's just like, what, me? What do I matter? And I do want to tell students that I'm so ever grateful whenever my students like Ian, Dr. Thompson, continue to move forward and to move this field forward. It makes me extremely proud. So thank you for having me, Yakoke. I am extremely honored to have been here.
Sue also put out there that when the Cultural Center opens, we would like to extend an invitation to you, Joe, to be a presenter. So be on the lookout for that. So we'll make sure to send you a pointed email.
Oh, wonderful.
In your flurry of, invitations and emails on a daily basis. So,
any ideas on when possibly?
Well, I don't know specifics. Obviously, with the current situation, things are constantly shifting, but this fall we'll all be looking out for something to be happening. So Ian and Kristen, I want to make sure you guys get in any last words that you wanted to share with the group.
So just to answer that last question, the opening set for September 24th for the Cultural Center, but that is subject to change. That's what we have right now.
All right, I will put it in my calendar right now.
I do have another question. Ryan Spring said that Ian Thompson would like to know, what is a flake, quote unquote.
What is a flake? Okay, a flake is, well, other than certain individuals I know, a flake is a piece of lithic material that retains at least a platform. So that's my definition.
That's a great answer. One of the interview questions we often have for the archaeological technician position is, what is a flake? And sometimes we get some really creative answers. So that's but again, I would like to thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience and intelligence. It's, hearing you talk makes me remember how much I miss being in class with you. So thank you for all you shared.
I love this. It's again, it's my honor to be here and to be a part of this wonderful organization.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. It's been a great way to spend a Friday with you.
It's a great way to spend a Friday morning with you all.
All right, with that, it looks like we've answered all the questions, all the Q&A. Lots of people really sent in their thanks and just for having you join us. And so with that, I think we can go ahead and head off, and the recording will be available on the Choctaw Nation Cultural Services website. That's ChoctawNationCulture.com. And so there's a Choctaw Tosholi page. You can join the listserv, and hopefully you can join us for the next session. So we'll just continually have sessions every 2 weeks, and we have a great line of speakers coming up. So be sure to follow along, and also on the Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation Facebook page. So thank you again, Joe, for joining us, and Ian and Kristen as well, and Kristen for all your great questions, and hope you guys have a great weekend. All right.
Good job, Kristen.
Thanks, everybody.
Again. All right.
Bye.
Bye.